Hey there! Are you a country or company responsible for a vast amount of emissions?
Yes, I am.
But you've decided to do something about it at COP26.
That's right.
Well, then you're going to want a net zero plan. And here are my tips to make sure it adds up.
Let's go.
Yes, let's.
But maybe first just remind me what net zero actually is.
To stop the world heating up, polluters need to stop adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. That's the zero in net zero. To do that, they need to cut emissions as much as possible and then find some way to remove the remaining emissions that they can't otherwise cut. And that's the net in net zero, that last little bit of cancelling out of emissions.
Okay, sounds good. Net zero it is.
And for our most ambitious climate change targets, the entire world needs to reach net zero around 2050.
Okay, so I've taken all of that on board and we've just announced our net zero by 2050 target.
Nice one. So what's the plan?
Well, the plan was that we would announce the target, then everyone would applaud us because we are so awesome, and then they'd leave us alone.
That's not exactly the kind of plan I had in mind. You need detailed short-term targets to actually show how you'll get to net zero, and then to start cutting emissions ASAP.
Can't I just cram in all the work at the last minute?
Well, firstly, no. And secondly, I can't believe so many big polluters are genuinely asking that. The more you delay, the harder it will get, because then you'll just have to cut emissions even faster. Next, your net zero emissions plan actually needs to get all your emissions to net zero. So say you're a
net zero supermarket.
Well, then you need to bring all the electricity, cooling, heating, all of that to net zero.
Sure, I can do that.
But then you could and should be looking to expand the net outwards. I'm talking about transport fleets, suppliers, land use, all of these things which feed into the emissions of the products you're selling.
You mean actually getting the whole system to be net zero?
Well, yeah. But right now, plenty of organizations are going net zero, but then completely ignoring the most emissions-intensive activities connected with their business. Like take a
net zero airport,
for example, which doesn't engage with flying's huge carbon footprint. So once you've worked out the emissions that you need to cut, you actually need to be taking responsibility for your own emissions.
Okay, here's the plan.
Cool, very detailed, but right here it just says get someone else to do it.
Oh yeah, right. I was kind of hoping you wouldn't notice that. Well, cutting our own emissions seemed really hard, so we figured we'd just pay someone else to cut their emissions, and then we'd count that as cuts to our emissions. Clever, right?
Well, no. Wrong. This is what we call carbon offsets, and buying offsets just shifts the work onto others. It's no substitute for just cutting your emissions yourself.
So are you saying there's no place for carbon offsets in net zero plans?
Well, no, but it only makes sense to offset those last little bits of emissions that we currently can't decarbonize, things like steel manufacture or long-distance shipping. Everything else, the vast majority of emissions, needs to be cut directly.
Okay, I'll cut all the emissions I can myself, and then I'll buy some offsets for the rest. I think I saw some pretty cheap ones on awesomeoffsetsforyou.biz.
Well, I hate to break it to you, but those offsets might not actually be so awesome.
I can't believe that the internet would lie to me.
Firstly, most offsets you can buy avoid emissions rather than actually absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And secondly, a lot of them don't even do that. For example, by protecting forest, which no one was even going to cut down in the first place.
Okay, I'll only get properly certified offsets.
Great, but now we have another big issue. Tech.
Great. I've been waiting for this. Steve Jobs is going to save the day, right?
Wait, did no one tell you?
Tell me what?
Never mind. But no, tech is not going to save the day.
But I love tech.
I know you do, buddy. But there are just no high-tech silver bullets here. Loads of net zero plans rely heavily on technology that doesn't fully exist yet, whether that's next generation nuclear power plants or some way of sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But we don't know when or even if these technologies will arrive, or how practical they'd even be if they arrive.
So what? We're not going to bother innovating? And does that mean I have to stop saying, next stop, innovation station?
Of course you can still say innovation station, if you have to.
Phew.
And of course, new technology will play a part. But the truth is that we already have the technology we need to dramatically cut emissions today. And we need to cut emissions dramatically today. Not in years or decades when hopefully this new tech arrives.
Okay, gotcha. So in my net zero plan, I should be focusing on cutting my emissions as close to zero as possible, as quickly as possible.
Exactly. But in way too many net zero plans, there's far too much hype about the net and not enough focus on the zero. Look, net zero plans are awesome, in theory. Countries and companies are committing to targets which, on the face of it, would go a long way to protecting both people and planet.
Okay, but I'm sensing a but coming up.
But if you peer under the surface, many of these announcements have no real plan of how to get to net zero, or have plans which are just full of holes. And that's what we in the biz call greenwashing, pretending to be green when you're nothing of the sort.
How do you do, fellow environmentalists?
So to all the countries and companies that I'm sure are watching this, make sure your net zero plan really does add up to zero. This video was made with support from the ECF, as well as ever, my patrons over on Patreon. If you're watching the events of COP26 and feeling like it's far too little, far too late, well, I feel you. But just know that it's never too late to act on climate change. Check out my video over here if you want to know what I'm talking about. Okay, until next time, bye.